The carriage jolted hard over a broken stone, and Elena Whitmore nearly bit through her own tongue. Outside the small window, torches lined a road she did not recognize, and the forest on either side stood so tall and so silent that it felt like it was holding its breath, waiting to see what she would do. She was not supposed to be in this carriage. She was not supposed to be wearing this heavy blue gown, or this veil that smelled of someone else's perfume, or these gloves that pinched at her wrists. She was supposed to be at home, in the small room above the bakery, kneading dough before sunrise, and listening to her sister complain about the wedding she did not want. But her sister, Serafina, had collapsed the night before travel, burning with fever, her whole body shaking so badly that their mother had wept and their father had paced the floor until dawn. And somewhere in that long, terrible night, a decision had been made, without ever truly being spoken aloud. Elena would go in her place, just until Serafina recovered, just long enough to keep the peace between two kingdoms that had been at the edge of war for a generation. Nobody had asked Elena if she wanted this. Nobody ever did. The carriage slowed, and her heart slammed against her ribs so hard she thought the guards outside might hear it. Somewhere ahead, past a line of iron gates and stone towers, waited Cale Ashworth, the alpha king of the northern packs, a man whose name alone made grown soldiers lower their eyes. She had heard the stories her whole life, that he had taken his throne at 19 after his father was murdered, that he had ended a 5-year war within 2 seasons, that he did not smile, did not forgive, and did not lose. The court called him the Iron Wolf. The commoners called him something else, something they only whispered when the doors were shut. Elena pressed her gloved hand against her stomach, trying to steady her breathing. She was not a princess. She was not even the daughter anyone had planned to send. She was the second daughter, the quiet one, the one who mended dresses and counted coins and stayed out of every important conversation. She had spent her whole life standing 2 steps behind Serafina, and now she was about to walk straight into the deepest part of her sister's future, wearing her sister's name. The carriage stopped. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the door swung open, and cold night air rushed in, carrying the sharp scent of pine and something else beneath it, something wild and ancient that made the small hairs on the back of Elena's neck rise. A gloved hand appeared in the doorway, waiting. She looked at it for a heartbeat too long. "My lady," said a low voice, not impatient, but not warm either. "The king is waiting." Elena forced herself to breathe, to remember every instruction her mother had whispered into her ear before she left. "Keep your eyes down. Speak only when spoken to. Do not, under any circumstance, let him see that you are afraid." She placed her hand in the stranger's palm and stepped out into a world that was about to change everything. The courtyard stretched wide before her, lit by rows of torches that threw long shadows across gray stone. Guards stood at careful intervals, their eyes sharp, their postures still. And at the top of a short set of stairs, framed by 2 enormous carved doors, stood a man who did not need a crown to make it clear who ruled this place. Cale Ashworth was taller than she expected, broad through the shoulders, dressed simply in black, with no jewels, no ornaments, nothing to soften the impression he made. His hair was dark, cut short, and his face held an expression that gave nothing away. But it was his eyes that stopped her breath. They were a pale, striking gold, and when they landed on her, she felt them the way one feels the first cold wind before a storm. He did not smile. He did not bow. He simply studied her, the way a man studies a locked door, before deciding whether to break it down or find the key. "Lady Serafina," he said. His voice was quiet, but it carried across the entire courtyard without effort. "You are later than expected." Elena's throat went dry. She had rehearsed this moment 100 times in the carriage, had practiced holding her sister's posture, her sister's slight tilt of the chin, her sister's careful, practiced smile. But standing in front of him now, all of it threatened to slip away like water through her fingers. "The roads were difficult, Your Grace," she managed, and was relieved when her voice came out steadier than she felt. Something flickered across his face, there and gone so fast she almost missed it. He descended the stairs slowly, each step deliberate, until he stood close enough that she had to tilt her head back to hold his gaze. Up close, she could see faint lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the kind that came from carrying something heavy for far too long. "You do not look the way I imagined," he said. Her heart stopped. I have not slept properly in 3 days, Your Grace, she said quickly. Grief does strange things to a person's appearance. It was not entirely a lie. She had barely slept, though not from grief, but from fear, so thick it had settled into her bones. His eyes narrowed slightly, and for one terrifying second, she was certain he could see straight through the veil, straight through the borrowed name, straight into the truth of who she really was. Then he simply nodded, once, and turned toward the doors. Come, he said. You will want to rest before tomorrow. She followed him inside, past walls lined with old banners and portraits of stern-faced men, who all shared the same golden eyes, and she tried very hard not to notice the way her whole body was still trembling, or the way the space between her shoulder blades prickled every time she felt him glance back to make certain she was still there. That night, alone in a chamber larger than her entire home above the bakery, Elena sat by the window and stared out at the dark shapes of the mountains beyond the palace walls. Somewhere far away, her real family was waiting for word that she had arrived safely, that the deception was holding, that no war would come because of a fever that struck at exactly the wrong moment. She thought of Serafina, pale and shaking in their shared bed, whispering through cracked lips that she was sorry, that she had never wanted any of this, that she would make it up to Elena somehow. She thought of her mother's hands shaking as she fastened the gown that did not quite fit right across Elena's shoulders. She thought of her father, unable to look her in the eye as the carriage pulled away. And she thought of the Alpha King, standing at the top of those stairs, his golden eyes cutting through the darkness like twin blades, studying her, as though he already suspected something was wrong. Elena pressed her forehead against the cold glass and closed her eyes. Whatever happened next, there was no turning back now. The following morning arrived far too quickly. Elena woke to the sound of servants moving quietly through the halls outside her door, and for one disoriented moment, she forgot where she was. Then the weight of the previous night settled back over her, heavy and undeniable, and she sat up in the unfamiliar bed with her heart already racing. A young woman entered without knocking, carrying a tray of tea and fresh bread, her eyes respectfully lowered. "Good morning, my lady. The king has asked that you join him for breakfast within the hour." Elena thanked her, forced down a few bites of bread her stomach did not want, and allowed herself to be dressed in another gown that was not hers, styled in a way that was not her own, until the woman in the mirror looked almost convincingly like Serafina. Almost. She studied her reflection a moment longer than necessary. Her sister had sharper cheekbones, a more confident set to her shoulders, a practiced grace that came from years of being told she would one day be important. Elena had none of that training. She had learned to be careful instead, to be quiet, to notice things other people missed because nobody ever expected her to be paying attention. Perhaps, she thought, that particular skill might actually be useful now. She found her way to the dining hall with the help of a guard who walked 2 steps behind her the entire way, silent and watchful. The room itself was smaller than she expected, warmed by a low fire, with a single long table set for 2. Kale was already seated when she arrived, a stack of papers pushed to one side, his sharp gaze rising to meet hers the moment she entered. "You slept well, I hope," he said, though something in his tone suggested he did not entirely believe the answer would be yes. "Well enough, Your Grace." She took the seat offered to her, folding her hands carefully in her lap the way her mother had taught her. For a while, they ate in silence, the quiet stretching long enough that Elena began to wonder if this was simply how he was, distant and unreadable, or if he was watching her more closely than she realized. She kept her eyes on her plate, on the pattern of the tablecloth, on anything that was not his face, because every time she looked at him directly, she felt as though he might read every secret she was carrying. "Tell me about your sister," he said suddenly. Elena's fork stilled halfway to her mouth. "My sister, Your Grace. The younger one. Elena, I believe her name is." He said it plainly, without weight, but her pulse spiked anyway. "The reports I received described a quiet girl, fond of books, skilled with a needle and thread. She keeps to herself," Elena said carefully, forcing her voice to stay even. "She has always preferred small, simple things, a quiet life. And you do not share that preference." It was not quite a question. Elena looked up at him then, unable to help herself, and found his golden eyes fixed on her, with an intensity that made her stomach twist. "I have learned to want what is required of me, Your Grace," she said, and this time, the words came out steadier than she expected, because in a strange way, they were true. She had spent her whole life wanting whatever was left over after Serafina had taken her pick. Something shifted in his expression, something she could not quite name. He studied her for a long moment, long enough that she had to fight the urge to look away. "That is a very careful answer," he said finally. "I am told I am a careful person." The corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close enough that Elena felt an unexpected flicker of warmth in her chest, before she firmly told herself to stop noticing things like that. The rest of breakfast passed with careful, guarded conversation, questions about the road, about her family, about small details that she answered as best she could, using everything Serafina had ever told her about her own life, filling in the gaps with instinct and hope. Each time his questions circled a little too close to the truth, her heart climbed higher into her throat, but each time, she managed to find her footing again. It was not until they stood to leave the table that he said something that nearly broke her composure entirely. "You do not smell the way I remember," he said quietly, almost to himself, as though he had not meant to say it aloud. Elena froze. "Your Grace?" He blinked, and whatever had crossed his mind seemed to close off behind his eyes, just as quickly as it had appeared. "It is nothing," he said. "A trick of travel and exhaustion, perhaps." But as he turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone in the quiet dining hall, Elena could not shake the feeling that the Alpha King had noticed something was wrong, and that whatever came next would depend entirely on whether he chose to say so. Outside, beyond the tall windows, the sun climbed higher over the mountains, indifferent to the storm quietly building within the palace walls. Elena pressed a hand to her chest, feeling her own heartbeat hammering beneath her fingers, and understood, with sudden and complete clarity, that she had only just begun to understand how dangerous this place truly was. For the first time since stepping out of that carriage, she allowed herself to wonder, just for a moment, what would happen if the truth came out before her sister ever recovered enough to take her place. She did not have an answer. And somewhere deep in the palace, she suspected, neither did the king. 3 days passed before Elena began to understand that the palace itself was a kind of test, one she had not been warned about. Every hallway seemed to hold eyes. Every servant who bowed to her also watched her, weighing her steps, her posture, the way she held her fork, the way she folded a letter. She had known, in a distant way, that royal life came with scrutiny. She had not understood how relentless it would be. Kale kept his distance during those first days, appearing only at meals, speaking little, offering no warmth and no cruelty either. He simply observed, the way a hunter observes a trail before deciding which direction to follow. Elena told herself this was a mercy. It gave her time to learn the shape of her new life, without the added pressure of his full attention. But some nights, lying awake in the enormous cold bed, she found herself thinking of his golden eyes, and the strange, unsettling comment he had made at breakfast, and she wondered if his distance was not mercy at all, but patience. The kind of patience a predator uses when it already knows exactly where its prey will run. On the 4th morning, everything changed. A messenger arrived at dawn, breathless from a hard ride, carrying word that a delegation from the Eastern Pax had crossed into Northern territory without permission. Elena did not fully understand the politics of it, only that the entire palace seemed to tighten like a fist the moment the news spread. Guards doubled at every gate. Advisors filled the halls with hurried, worried voices. And Kale, when she finally saw him again, looked like a different man entirely, sharp and cold and utterly focused, every trace of the quiet, watchful figure from breakfast, replaced by something harder. "You will attend the council meeting this afternoon," he told her, not quite a request. "As my intended bride, your presence will be expected." Elena's stomach dropped. She had no experience with councils, no understanding of borders or treaties, or the delicate balance of power between packs that had been enemies for longer than she had been alive. But she nodded, because refusing was not an option available to her, and spent the rest of the morning trying to absorb everything a nervous young attendant named Margaret could tell her about the Eastern Pax, about Alpha Silas Drummond, about the long, complicated history of blood and broken promises between the two territories. The council chamber, when she finally entered it that afternoon, was nothing like she expected. She had imagined something grand and ceremonial, but instead found a long table surrounded by serious, weathered faces, maps spread across the wood, voices already raised in argument before she had even taken her seat. Cale sat at the head of the table, silent, listening, letting his advisors argue, while his golden eyes moved slowly across the room, missing nothing. Elena took the seat offered to her near his side, grateful that nobody seemed to expect her to speak. She listened instead, absorbing every word, every raised voice, every flicker of tension between the men gathered around the table. An older advisor named Edmund Vale argued for immediate, forceful action, warning that any hesitation would be read as weakness. A younger commander disagreed, insisting that a hasty response could ignite the very war they had spent years trying to avoid. Through it all, Cale said almost nothing, until the arguments had circled the same points 3 or 4 times over, and the room had grown loud enough that nobody noticed him lean slightly toward Elena. "What do you think?" he asked quietly, so only she could hear. Elena's heart lurched. She was not supposed to think anything. She was supposed to stay quiet, to blend into the background, to avoid drawing any attention that might expose the lie she was carrying. But something about the desperate, circular nature of the argument in front of her made the words rise up before she could stop them. "I think," she said carefully, keeping her voice low, "that Alpha Drummond would not send a delegation across the border without permission, unless he wanted to be noticed. If he wished to hide his movements, he could have. This feels less like an invasion, and more like a message." Cale went very still beside her. "A message," he repeated. "Perhaps he wants to see how you will respond before he commits to anything larger," Elena continued, encouraged despite her fear, because the words made sense to her the moment she said them aloud. "A show of strength that costs him nothing, in exchange for information about your temperament. If that is true, then reacting with force may be exactly what he hopes you will do." The table had gone quiet around them. Elena realized, with a jolt of horror, that her voice had carried further than she intended, and every eye in the room was now fixed on her. For a long, terrible moment, nobody spoke. Then Cale turned to his commander. "Send a smaller envoy. No weapons drawn, no show of force. I want to know what Drummond is truly testing before we give him the reaction he is hoping for." The room erupted into fresh discussion, some agreeing, some arguing, but Elena barely heard any of it, because Cale had turned his head just slightly toward her, studying her with an expression she could not quite read, something between surprise and quiet, careful respect. "That was well reasoned," he said, so quietly it was almost lost beneath the noise of the room. "Thank you, Your Grace," she whispered back, and hated the way her cheeks warmed at the simple words. After the meeting ended and the room slowly emptied, Cale did not immediately leave. He remained seated, watching the last of his advisors file out, until only Elena remained beside him, unsure whether she was meant to stay or go. "You surprise me," he said finally, once the doors had closed. "I did not mean to speak out of turn. That is not what I meant." He turned in his chair to face her fully, his golden eyes searching her face in a way that made her feel as though he were trying to peel back a layer of skin to see what lay beneath. "The reports I received about you describe someone quiet, someone who preferred books and needlework to politics and war. And yet here you sit, reading the intentions of a rival Alpha more clearly than half the men in this room." Elena's pulse pounded so hard, she was certain he could hear it. "People are not always exactly as they are described, Your Grace." "No," he agreed slowly, "they are not." Something passed between them then, something Elena did not have a name for, a tension that was not quite fear, and not quite anything else she recognized. She looked away first, unable to hold his gaze any longer, terrified that if she did, he would see straight through every careful lie she had built since stepping out of that carriage. Over the following days, the strange, careful distance between them began to shift. Cale sought her out more often, not just at meals, but during quiet afternoons in the gardens, during walks along the palace walls where he would ask her opinion on matters she had no right to understand, yet somehow, always seemed to grasp. She told herself it meant nothing, that he was simply a careful ruler gathering every possible piece of information before deciding how much to trust his intended bride. But some nights, when he laughed quietly at something she said, a rare, unguarded sound that seemed to surprise even him, she found herself forgetting entirely that none of this was supposed to be real. It was during one such evening, walking along a quiet stretch of garden path beneath a sky full of early stars, that Cale stopped walking altogether and turned to face her directly. "May I ask you something honestly?" he said, "and trust that you will answer the same way?" Elena's stomach twisted into a knot. "Of course, Your Grace. Are you afraid of me?" The question caught her completely off guard. She had expected something about politics, about the Eastern Pax, about the wedding itself. Not this, not something so simple and so dangerously close to the truth of everything she was hiding. "I was," she admitted slowly, choosing her words with great care. "When I first arrived, the stories about you are not gentle ones. And now?" She looked up at him, at the sharp lines of his face softened by starlight, at the careful, guarded hope hiding somewhere behind his golden eyes, and felt something inside her chest crack open just slightly. "Now I am not certain the stories were entirely true," she said quietly. Cale studied her for a long moment, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating off him despite the cool evening air. "Good," he said finally, his voice low, "because I find I would like you to keep discovering that, for as long as you are willing." Elena's breath caught in her throat, and for one terrifying, wonderful moment, she forgot every reason why this closeness was dangerous, why every smile she gave him was built on top of a lie, why the woman he was slowly beginning to trust did not even exist beneath the name she wore. She only remembered, walking back to her chamber alone that night, staring at her own reflection in the dark glass of her window, that somewhere far away, her sister was recovering, growing stronger every single day. And when Serafina was strong enough to travel, everything Elena had allowed herself to feel in that garden would have to be handed back to the woman it was always meant to belong to. The letter arrived on a gray morning, carried by a rider who had pushed his horse hard through the night. Elena recognized her mother's handwriting the moment the folded paper was placed in her hands, and her fingers trembled so badly she nearly tore the seal in her rush to open it. Serafina was recovering. The fever had broken 5 days earlier, and though she remained weak, the healer believed she would be strong enough to travel within 2 more weeks. Elena read the words 3 times before she let herself absorb what they truly meant. 2 weeks. She had 2 weeks left to be someone she was not. 2 weeks left in this strange, beautiful, dangerous life that had never actually belonged to her. 2 weeks left beside a man who had begun looking at her as though she were the only person in any room he entered. She folded the letter carefully and tucked it into the drawer of her writing desk, then sat very still for a long time, staring out at the mountains beyond her window, trying to understand why the news that should have brought her relief, instead, felt like a stone settling into her chest. She did not have long to sit with the feeling. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts, and Margaret entered with an apologetic expression. "The king has requested your presence in the training yard, my lady. He said it was important." Elena frowned, confused. She had never been summoned to the training yard before, a place reserved for soldiers and warriors, not for a bride awaiting her wedding. But she rose, smoothed her skirts, and followed Margaret through the palace halls until they emerged into bright, cold sunlight and the sound of clashing wood. The training yard stretched wide behind the eastern wall, ringed by stone benches where a handful of advisors and warriors stood, watching 2 fighters circle each other with wooden practice swords. Cale stood among them, arms crossed, his expression unreadable, until his eyes found Elena approaching, and something in his posture shifted, just slightly. "You wish to see me, Your Grace?" she asked once she reached his side. "I did." He gestured toward the sparring fighters, one of them a broad-shouldered warrior Elena did not recognize, the other a woman with sharp eyes and quick, precise movements, who fought with a confidence Elena had never seen in anyone before, let alone another woman. "This is Captain Hannah Reyes. She commands my personal guard." The woman offered Elena a brief, respectful nod before returning her attention to her opponent, disarming him with a swift, practiced motion that drew a low laugh from the gathered soldiers. "I did not realize women served among your warriors," Elena said, genuinely curious, despite the strangeness of the moment. "Among the northern Pax, strength matters more than the shape of the body that carries it," Cale said simply. "Captain Reyes has saved my life more times than I can count." Elena studied the captain with fresh interest, watching the easy, confident way she moved, and felt a small, unfamiliar spark of something she did not immediately recognize as admiration. "I wanted you to see this," Kale continued, because I intend to have Captain Reyes begin training you. Elena turned to him, certain she had misheard. Training me, Your Grace? You will one day be queen of this kingdom, he said, his voice quiet but firm. A queen who cannot defend herself is a queen who depends entirely on others for her safety. I do not wish that dependence for you. Not after what I witnessed in the council chamber. You have a mind built for strategy. It would be a waste not to also arm you with the skill to protect what that mind builds. Something warm and unfamiliar bloomed in Elena's chest, a feeling she quickly tried to suppress, because it was dangerous to feel proud of praise that was never meant for her in the first place. Serafina was the one who would inherit this offer, this training, this growing trust. Elena was only borrowing it, and every day that borrowed time continued, the debt grew heavier. But when Captain Reyes handed her a practice sword later that afternoon and showed her the first simple stance, Elena found she could not entirely resist the small, fierce thrill of holding a weapon in her own two hands for the first time in her life. The following days blurred together in a rhythm Elena had never imagined for herself. Mornings were spent in the training yard, her arms aching, her palms blistered, her body slowly learning movements that felt foreign, and then, gradually, less so. Afternoons were spent in council meetings where her voice, once silent, now spoke more freely, offering observations that Kale increasingly seemed to seek out rather than merely tolerate. Evenings belonged to quiet walks through the garden, conversations that stretched longer each night, laughter that came easier, glances that lingered a heartbeat too long. Elena told herself, again and again, that none of it was real, that she was simply a placeholder, a temporary shape wearing her sister's name, and that every moment of closeness between herself and Kale Ashworth was borrowed time that belonged, by right and by blood, to someone else. But lies, she was learning, grew harder to believe the longer a person lived inside them. It was Captain Reyes who first said something that cracked the careful wall Elena had built around her heart. They were alone in the training yard one gray morning, practicing a defensive stance for what felt like the 100th time, when the captain paused, studying Elena with an expression that was suddenly far too perceptive. You do not fight like someone who has spent her whole life waiting to be queen, Hannah said, tilting her head slightly. You fight like someone who has spent her whole life watching from the edges, learning to survive on scraps of attention. There is a difference. Elena's stomach dropped. I do not know what you mean. I have trained many soldiers, Hannah continued, lowering her practice sword. I know the difference between someone raised to expect the world and someone raised to expect nothing. You move like the second. I only wonder why the reports about Lady Serafina described the first. For one horrifying, endless moment, Elena could not breathe. She opened her mouth, searching desperately for some explanation, some careful lie that might smooth over the crack that had just opened beneath her. But nothing came, and the silence stretched long enough that Hannah's sharp eyes narrowed with growing understanding. You are not going to answer that, the captain said slowly, because you cannot. Please, Elena whispered, her voice breaking. Please, I can explain. Hannah studied her for a long, tense moment, her expression unreadable, before finally lowering her sword completely and stepping closer. I do not yet know what you are hiding, she said quietly, but I have watched you these past weeks. Whatever the truth is, it has not made you cruel, or careless, or dangerous to this kingdom. And the king, she added, her voice softening slightly, has not smiled this often in the 3 years I have served him. Elena's eyes filled with unexpected tears. If he learns the truth, he will hate me. He will think everything between us has been a performance. Then perhaps, Hannah said carefully, you should decide whether it has been, before that choice is taken away from you by someone else's discovery instead of your own honesty. The words settled over Elena like a weight she could not put down. That night, alone in her chamber, she stared at the folded letter still hidden in her writing desk, the one that promised her sister's recovery, the one that marked the slow, steady countdown toward the end of everything she had somehow, impossibly, begun to want for herself. She thought of Kale's rare laughter in the garden, of the careful, growing trust in his golden eyes, of the strange, fierce pride she felt every time he sought her opinion in the council chamber. She thought of her sister, still recovering, still believing that Elena was simply holding a place warm until she was well enough to return. And she thought, with a slow, sinking dread, of what would happen the moment Cale discovered that the woman he had begun to trust, the woman he walked beside beneath the stars, was not the bride he had been promised at all. The choice Hannah had spoken of settled heavily in Elena's chest as the days continued to slip away. Twice, she found herself standing outside Cale's private study, hand raised to knock, the truth trembling on her tongue, only to lose her courage at the last moment and retreat before he ever knew she had been there. It was not fear of punishment that stopped her, though that fear was certainly real. It was something worse. It was the terrible certainty that the moment she spoke the truth aloud, the warmth in his eyes when he looked at her, warmth she had done nothing to earn and everything to hide, would turn instantly and permanently to something cold. She was not ready to lose that warmth, not yet. So she said nothing, and the days continued to pass, each one bringing her sister's recovery closer, each one binding Elena more tightly to a life and a love that were never supposed to belong to her at all. The second letter arrived without warning, carried not by a rider from her family, but by a royal envoy dressed in the deep green colors of her own house, colors Elena had not seen since the day she left home. She knew, the instant she saw the envoy step down from his horse in the courtyard, that something had gone terribly wrong. She was in the garden when the summons reached her, walking beside Cale in the pale afternoon light, listening to him describe, with rare and unguarded enthusiasm, a childhood memory of hunting in these very mountains with his brother, before the war had taken him. She had grown so used to these quiet moments that when Margaret appeared at the edge of the garden path, pale and out of breath, Elena felt the sudden interruption like a blow. "My lady," Margaret said, her voice shaking, "you are needed. Immediately." Elena's stomach dropped. Beside her, Cale's expression sharpened, the warmth of a moment ago vanishing instantly beneath the sharp, watchful focus of a ruler sensing danger. "What has happened?" he asked. Margaret's eyes flickered nervously between them. "It concerns the Whitmore family, Your Grace. I believe it would be best if Lady Seraphina heard it privately." Elena felt the ground shift beneath her feet at the sound of that name spoken aloud, a name that was not truly hers, spoken by someone who did not yet know the truth she was about to face. She followed Margaret through the palace at a near run, her heart pounding so violently she could hear it in her own ears, until they reached a small receiving room where the envoy waited, his face grim. He held a rolled parchment sealed with her family's crest, and the moment Elena broke the seal and unrolled it, her entire body went cold. Seraphina had recovered, fully, weeks earlier than expected, and in her impatience to see the palace and the man she had been promised to her whole life, she had insisted on traveling immediately, without waiting for further word, without warning anyone of her early arrival. She would reach the palace within 2 days. Elena stood frozen in the small receiving room, the parchment trembling in her hands, and felt every carefully built piece of her borrowed life begin to crack apart at once. 2 days. She had told herself she had weeks. She had told herself there would be time to find the right moment, the right words, some careful way to soften a truth that had no soft edges left to offer. Now there was no time at all. She did not sleep that night. She lay awake staring at the dark ceiling of her chamber, running through every possible version of the conversation she needed to have with Cale, every possible way to explain a lie that had grown so large it now touched every part of her life within these walls. She thought of Hannah's warning, of the choice she had refused to make when she still had the luxury of choosing. By morning, exhaustion had hollowed her out completely, but it had also given her a strange, steady clarity. She would tell him herself, today, before Seraphina's arrival stripped that choice away from her entirely. She found him in his private study, bent over a stack of reports, his dark hair falling slightly across his forehead, in a way that made something in her chest ache even now, even knowing what she was about to destroy. "Cale," she said, and the use of his given name, something she had never dared before, made him look up immediately, his golden eyes sharpening with concern at whatever he saw in her expression. "What is it?" he asked, rising from his chair. Elena's mouth had gone completely dry. She had rehearsed the words 100 times through the long night, and now, standing in front of him, every single one of them scattered like smoke. "There is something I should have told you weeks ago," she began, her voice shaking, despite every effort to steady it. "Something I was too afraid, and then too selfish to say." His expression shifted, confusion giving way slowly to something more guarded. "You are frightening me, Elena." The sound of her true name in his mouth broke something loose inside her chest, a sob rising so suddenly she had to press a hand against her lips to hold it back. "You already know," she whispered. For a long, terrible moment, he simply stared at her, and she watched, with growing horror, as understanding moved slowly across his face, piece by piece, like a puzzle assembling itself against his will. His jaw tightened. His hands curled slowly into fists at his sides. "Say it," he said, his voice low and dangerously controlled. "Say it plainly." "I am not Serafina," Elena said, the words finally breaking free after weeks of careful silence. "I am her sister, Elena. She fell ill the night before we were meant to travel, and my parents feared what would happen if the wedding was delayed, so they sent me in her place, believing I would only need to hold her position until she recovered enough to take it herself." The silence that followed felt endless. Cale did not move, did not speak, his golden eyes fixed on her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, something raw and wounded beneath the careful control he was clearly fighting to maintain. "How long have you known that I did not know?" he asked finally, his voice deceptively quiet. "Since the beginning," Elena admitted, tears finally spilling freely down her face. "I should have told you the moment I understood how deep this had gone. I should have told you before I ever let myself care for you as much as I do. I am so sorry, Cale. I never meant for any of this to become what it has become." "Do not," he said sharply, cutting her off, and the sudden coldness in his voice made her flinch. "Do not tell me what you meant, or did not mean. I opened parts of myself to you that I have not shown to another living soul since my brother died. I trusted you with the safety of my kingdom, with decisions that shaped the fate of my people, and every single moment of that trust was built on a name that was never yours to wear." "I know," Elena whispered. "I know, and I cannot ask you to forgive that. I only needed you to hear the truth from me, before it reached you any other way." Cale turned away from her, moving to the window, his shoulders rigid with a tension that seemed to fill the entire room. When he finally spoke again, his voice had lost some of its sharpness, replaced by something heavier, more exhausted. "Your sister arrives in 2 days," he said, not quite a question. "Yes. And the entire court will expect the wedding to proceed as planned, with the woman it was always meant to include." Elena's chest ached so fiercely, she thought it might actually break. "Yes." He was silent for a long moment, staring out at the mountains beyond the glass, and Elena stood frozen behind him, uncertain whether to stay or go, uncertain whether anything she said now could possibly matter. "Leave me," he said finally, his voice quiet and final. "Please." She left without another word, walking through the palace halls in a daze, past servants, who did not yet know that everything was about to change, past guards who still bowed to her as though she were someone worth bowing to, until she reached her chamber and finally allowed herself to collapse against the closed door, sobbing in a way she had not allowed herself since the night she first climbed into that carriage. Word of the deception did not stay contained for long. By the following morning, whispers had already begun moving through the palace like smoke through cracks in a wall, servants exchanging wide-eyed glances, advisors gathering in hushed, urgent clusters. Elena did not need to hear the words directly to understand what they were saying. She could feel it in every glance that slid away from her the moment she entered a room, in every careful, uncomfortable silence that followed her down the halls. By afternoon, Edmund Vale, the same sharp-eyed advisor who had argued so fiercely in the council chamber weeks earlier, appeared at her chamber door with 2 armed guards flanking him, his expression grim. "Lady Elena," he said, using her true name with a coldness that made it sound like an accusation, "you are to remain in this chamber until the king decides what is to be done with you. Impersonating a royal bride is a crime taken seriously among our people. I would advise you not to test how seriously." The door closed and locked behind him, and Elena sank onto the edge of her bed, staring at her own trembling hands, understanding, with slow, sickening clarity, that the warmth and trust she had built over the past weeks might not be enough to save her from the consequences of the lie that had built it. Outside her window, she could see activity spreading across the courtyard below, preparations already beginning for Serafina's arrival the following morning. Somewhere in that same palace, Cale Ashworth sat with a decision no one envied, caught between the alliance his kingdom desperately needed, and a truth that had upended everything he believed about the woman he had begun, against every careful instinct, to love. Elena pressed her forehead against the cool glass of her window and closed her eyes, waiting for a verdict she was no longer certain would go in her favor. Serafina Whitmore arrived at the palace gates the following morning, dressed in traveling silks far grander than anything Elena had ever worn, her face still slightly pale from her illness, but otherwise glowing, with the confident excitement of a woman finally stepping into the life she had always believed belonged to her. She had no idea, as her carriage rolled through the gates, that the palace she was entering had spent the previous night consumed by whispers of scandal, or that the sister who had traveled ahead of her was, at that very moment, locked inside a chamber awaiting judgment. Elena watched the arrival from her window, guarded on either side by silent soldiers, and felt something twist painfully in her chest at the sight of her sister stepping down from the carriage with such easy, practiced grace, greeted by advisors who bowed low and murmured words of welcome that had, weeks earlier, been offered to Elena instead. It did not take long for the truth to reach Serafina. Elena heard it happen indirectly, through the tense, hurried conversations of the guards outside her door, through the sudden commotion that rippled through the palace less than an hour after her sister's arrival. She imagined the scene without needing to witness it, her sister's confusion turning to horror, then to anger, as Edmund Vale explained, in careful, clipped words, exactly what Elena had done in her absence. By evening, Elena was summoned, not to a private conversation, but to the throne room itself, where the full council had gathered along with Serafina, Cale, and a crowd of curious nobles, who had clearly heard enough rumors to want to witness the truth unfold with their own eyes. Elena walked into that room with her chin raised, refusing to let her fear show on her face, though her hands trembled at her sides. Serafina stood near the front of the gathered crowd, her expression a complicated mixture of hurt and fury, and when their eyes met, Elena felt the weight of every unspoken apology between them pressing down at once. "You had no right," Serafina said, her voice carrying across the silent room, sharp with betrayal. "This was my future, my place, and you simply took it, without ever once asking whether I might have wanted it back." "I did not take it to keep it," Elena said quietly, though her voice shook. "I only meant to protect it until you were well enough to reclaim it yourself." "And did you also mean to fall in love with the man promised to me?" Serafina shot back, and the room's collective breath seemed to catch at once, every eye swinging toward Cale, who stood silent and rigid beside the throne, his expression carefully unreadable. Elena had no answer that would not condemn her further, so she said nothing at all, and the silence stretched long and painful across the throne room. It was Edmund Vale who finally broke it, stepping forward with the cold authority of a man who had spent years enforcing the laws of this kingdom without exception. "Your Grace," he said, addressing Cale directly, "the law regarding impersonation of a royal bride is clear. Exile, at minimum. Execution, if the council judges the deception to have endangered the kingdom's alliances." A ripple of murmurs spread through the gathered nobles. Elena felt her knees weaken beneath her, and beside her, she heard Hannah Reyes draw in a sharp, protective breath, though the captain remained carefully silent, unable to intervene in matters of formal council judgment. Cale rose slowly from his throne, and the entire room fell utterly silent beneath the weight of his presence. His golden eyes moved from Elena to Serafina to the assembled council, before finally settling on Edmund Vale with an intensity that made even the older advisor take an involuntary step back. "The law exists to protect this kingdom from deception that threatens its stability," Cale said, his voice carrying easily across the silent room. "I will not pretend that what occurred here was not deception. It was. But I have spent these past weeks in the company of both women, now standing before me, and I can say with complete certainty that only one of them ever offered this kingdom anything of true value beyond her name." Serafina's face flushed with indignation. "Your Grace, You have not yet spent a single day within these walls," Cale continued, not unkindly, but firmly. "I do not fault you for a decision made on your behalf while you lay ill in a fevered bed. But I will not pretend that a marriage built solely on the correct name written on a betrothal contract is worth more to this kingdom than the woman who has spent these past weeks earning the trust of my council, my captain, and my people, through nothing but her own character. The room erupted into hushed, urgent whispers, and Edmund Vale's face had gone pale with disbelief. "Your Grace, you cannot possibly mean to suggest—" "I mean to suggest exactly what I am about to say plainly," Cale said, cutting him off, and then, turning fully to face Elena, his golden eyes softening in a way that made her breath catch painfully in her chest. "I refuse this contract, as it was originally written. I will not marry Lady Seraphina Whitmore. If a bond exists between myself and this family, it exists with the woman who has stood beside me these past weeks, deception and all. Elena Whitmore, if you will still have me, knowing everything now laid bare before this entire court." A stunned silence swallowed the throne room whole. Elena stared at him, certain for a moment that she had misheard, that grief and exhaustion had finally broken something loose in her own mind. But his expression remained steady, open, utterly sincere, and slowly, disbelief gave way to something warm and fragile blooming in her chest. "Cale," she whispered, "you cannot simply declare something like this, in front of your entire council, without consequence. Among our people," he said quietly, stepping down from the throne to stand directly before her. "A declaration such as this, spoken openly before witnesses, cannot be lightly withdrawn. I am aware of exactly what I am risking. I am asking whether you are willing to risk it beside me." Elena felt tears rising fast and hot, and for once, she did not try to stop them. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking on the single word. "Yes, I am." The throne room did not erupt into celebration. Instead, it fractured immediately into open dissent, several council members rising from their seats in furious protest, Edmund Vale's voice rising above the rest as he warned of broken contracts, of alliances threatened, of a precedent that could unravel decades of careful diplomacy. Seraphina stood frozen amid the chaos, her expression unreadable, caught somewhere between anger and, unexpectedly, quiet relief, at a future she had never truly wanted for herself in the first place. Elena barely had time to process the magnitude of what had just happened, before a guard burst through the throne room doors, breathless and pale, shouting words that sent the entire chamber into fresh panic. "Riders approaching from the eastern border. Alpha Silas Drummond has crossed into northern territory with a full war party. They are moving toward the palace." The chaos of the council chamber transformed instantly into something far more dangerous. Cale's expression hardened immediately, every trace of the tender, open man from moments earlier vanishing beneath the sharp, commanding presence of a king preparing for battle. "He has been waiting for exactly this kind of division," Cale said grimly, already moving toward the doors, his commanders falling into step behind him. A kingdom fractured by scandal and disagreement, its alpha's authority publicly challenged. Drummond has chosen his moment perfectly. Elena's heart pounded with fresh terror, not for herself now, but for him, for this kingdom she had come to care for far more deeply than she ever expected. "What do you need me to do?" Cale paused at the doorway, turning back to look at her, and despite the danger gathering at his borders, something steady and certain passed between them in that single glance. "Stay safe within these walls," he said. "That is all I ask of you tonight." But as the sound of preparation and mustering soldiers filled the palace around her, Elena thought of the weeks she had spent training beside Captain Hannah Reyes, of the sword calluses now marking her once soft palms, of the fierce, unfamiliar courage that had grown quietly inside her since the night she first stepped out of that carriage. She had spent her whole life staying safely out of the way, watching from the edges while others decided the shape of her life for her. She was not entirely certain, standing in the trembling, torchlit chaos of the palace preparing for war, that she was willing to do that any longer. The palace walls shook faintly under the distant sound of horns as Elena made her way through corridors filled with hurrying soldiers and frightened servants. She found Captain Reyes near the eastern armory, strapping on a final piece of leather armor, her sharp eyes flicking up in surprise as Elena approached. "You should be in your chamber," Hannah said, though there was little conviction behind the words. "I have spent weeks learning to hold a sword properly," Elena said, her voice steady, despite the fear coiled tight in her stomach. "I did not learn it so I could hide behind a locked door, while people I care about fight to protect a kingdom that is now, apparently, meant to be partly mine as well." Hannah studied her for a long moment, something like respect flickering across her weathered face. The king will not approve. The king is not here to argue with me. A faint, reluctant smile tugged at the corner of Hana's mouth. Then stay close to me, and do exactly as I say. This is not a training yard, Elena. Men will not simply lower their swords when you make a clever observation. Elena nodded, accepting the armor and blade Hana pressed into her hands, and together, they moved toward the outer walls, where Kale's forces were already gathering beneath torchlight, the distant sound of Alpha Drummond's approaching war party growing louder with every passing minute. Kale found her there, moments before the first horns sounded the call to formation, his expression darkening the instant he saw her standing armed among his soldiers. Elena, this is not your place. You told me once that a queen who cannot defend herself depends entirely on others for her safety, Elena said, meeting his gaze without flinching. I do not intend to be that kind of queen, tonight or ever. Let me help. For a long tense moment, she was certain he would refuse, would order Hana to escort her back inside, regardless of her protests. But something shifted in his expression instead, a fierce, complicated pride breaking through the fear, and he reached out to grip her hand briefly, tightly, before releasing it. Stay near Hana. Do not take unnecessary risks. If the line breaks, you retreat immediately. Promise me. I promise, Elena said, though even as she spoke the words, she was not entirely certain she would be able to keep them, once the fighting truly began. The battle that followed unfolded in chaotic, terrifying fragments. Elena would remember for the rest of her life, only in scattered pieces. The clash of steel against steel beneath torchlight, the desperate shouts of soldiers on both sides, the way her own hands, trembling at first, steadied gradually into the careful, practiced movements Hana had drilled into her over countless mornings in the training yard. She did not seek out violence. She stayed close to Hana as promised, defending rather than attacking, protecting a wounded soldier here, helping to hold a critical section of the wall there, her presence steady and useful in ways she had never imagined herself capable of before that night. It was near the height of the fighting, as Drummond's forces pressed hard against the northern gate, that something strange and unexpected happened. Elena felt it before she understood it, a sudden warmth spreading through her chest and down her arms, a strange humming energy that seemed to rise from somewhere deep inside her, unlike anything she had ever experienced. An old soldier fighting nearby stumbled, badly wounded, and without thinking, Elena moved instinctively to his side, pressing her hands against the wound as Hana had taught her, and the strange warmth in her chest surged suddenly outward, wrapping around the injured man like an invisible current. The bleeding slowed, his ragged breathing steadied, and the soldiers who witnessed it stared at Elena with wide, disbelieving eyes. Word of what happened spread through the battle lines with startling speed, and by the time the fighting finally began to turn in Kale's favor, whispers had already reached the front, whispers of an old bloodline long thought lost among the northern packs, a rare gift tied to the ancient magic that had first bound the packs together generations earlier, a gift that was said to mark a mate capable of strengthening an alpha's power, rather than simply standing beside it. Kale found her again near the end of the battle, as Drummond's remaining forces began a hasty, disorganized retreat beyond the border, and the look on his face when their eyes met told Elena immediately that he had heard the whispers too. You are certain you were not simply born to a quiet family, fond of books and needlework, he said, breathless from battle, but managing something close to a genuine, exhausted smile. I am beginning to think, Elena said, laughing despite the ache in her arms and the blood still drying on her borrowed armor, that nobody in my family truly knew who I was at all. The days following the battle passed in a strange, exhausted blur of recovery and rebuilding. Alpha Drummond's forces did not return, their defeat costly enough to discourage any further attempts at testing the Northern Pack's strength, and within the palace, the Council's earlier objections to Kale's declaration quietly softened beneath the undeniable proof of Elena's unexpected bloodline, proof that no one, not even Edmund Vale, could easily dismiss. Serafina, given time and distance to consider everything that had happened, found her own quiet peace with the outcome. She had never truly wanted the crushing weight of a crown she had only accepted because it was expected of her, and in the weeks that followed, she began speaking, tentatively at first, of returning home to a life she could actually choose for herself, free from the shadow of a betrothal that had never quite fit the shape of who she really was. The morning of Elena's true wedding arrived months later, beneath a clear sky that stretched endlessly over the mountains she had once viewed with such fear from the window of a stranger's carriage. She stood at the top of the same stone stairs where she had first seen Cale Ashworth, dressed not in her sister's borrowed gown, but in one made entirely for her, and looked out at a courtyard filled with the same guards, the same advisors, the same watchful eyes that had once studied her as an impostor, and now watched her instead as their rightful queen. Cale waited for her at the bottom of the stairs, dressed simply as always, no jewels, no unnecessary ornament, only the quiet, steady presence that had first drawn her attention on a night she arrived terrified, and pretending to be someone else entirely. "No disguises this time," he said softly as she reached him, his golden eyes warm, in a way she had once thought impossible for the Iron Wolf of the Northern Pax. "No disguises," Elena agreed, taking his offered hand, feeling the same current of quiet strength she had felt that very first night, except now, standing beside him, as exactly who she truly was. That strength no longer felt like something to fear. She had spent her entire life standing 2 steps behind her sister, invisible, overlooked, quietly certain that important things simply happened to other people. But somewhere between a desperate lie told to protect her family, and a truth finally spoken aloud, before an entire court, Elena Whitmore had discovered a version of herself she never knew existed, a version capable of leading, of fighting, of loving fully and honestly, without needing to borrow anyone else's name to do it. As the ceremony began, and the palace bells rang out across the mountains, announcing to the entire kingdom that the Alpha King had found his true queen, Elena understood, with quiet and complete certainty, that fate had simply been waiting, all along, for her to finally step forward and claim the place that had been hers from the very beginning. A full year passed before the Northern Pax faced their next true test, and this time, Elena did not stand at the edge of the council chamber waiting to be noticed. She sat beside Cale as his equal, her voice as steady in matters of war as it was in matters of peace, her name spoken now not as a scandal whispered through hallways, but as a queen, respected in her own right, across every territory bordering their kingdom. Captain Hannah Reyes remained close at her side through those months, no longer simply a trainer teaching a frightened newcomer how to hold a blade, but a trusted friend who had watched Elena grow into someone capable of standing firm, even when the ground beneath her felt uncertain. Together, they oversaw the training of a new generation of guards, many of them young women who had heard the story of the queen, who once fought beside her people, rather than hiding behind palace walls, and who now arrived at the training yard, hoping to learn the same quiet courage for themselves. Serafina wrote often from her new life in the Southern Territories, where she had settled near their parents, running a small trading business that suited her sharp mind far better than a crown ever could have. Her letters, once filled with hurt and quiet resentment, had slowly softened into something warmer, something closer to genuine affection, especially after Elena traveled to visit her during a rare quiet season, the 2 sisters finally speaking honestly with each other for the first time in years, untangling old habits of comparison and expectation that had shaped so much of their childhood. "I used to think you had everything easy," Serafina admitted during that visit, sitting across from Elena in a small sunlit kitchen that smelled of fresh bread, so different from the grand halls of the Northern Palace. Quiet, overlooked, free from the pressure everyone placed on me. "I did not understand, until all of this happened, how much you were carrying simply by being ignored." "I used to think the opposite," Elena admitted softly, "that you had everything you could ever want, simply by being seen." They had laughed then, a little sadly, a little fondly, understanding at last that neither of their lives had been as simple as the other had assumed, and that the space between sisters, however wide it had grown, could still be crossed with enough honesty and enough patience. Alpha Silas Drummond did not attempt another direct assault against the Northern Pax after his defeat, though tension along the eastern border never fully disappeared. Cale handled each new provocation with the same careful, deliberate strength Elena had first admired in that early council meeting, and increasingly, he turned to her not merely for opinion, but for partnership, trusting her instincts as thoroughly as his own. The strange gift that had first revealed itself on the night of battle continued to surface in unexpected moments, a warmth in her hands that could ease pain, calm a frightened animal, or settle the nerves of soldiers preparing for difficult missions. Scholars within the palace spent months studying old texts, piecing together fragments of a bloodline nearly lost to history, and slowly, Elena began to understand that her quiet, overlooked childhood had never been a sign of unimportance at all, but simply the long, patient waiting period before a life that finally required everything she had spent years quietly becoming. On the anniversary of the night she had first stepped out of that trembling carriage, terrified and pretending to be someone else entirely, Elena stood once again at the top of the palace stairs, watching the sun set behind the same mountains that had once seemed so cold and unfamiliar to her. Cale joined her there, slipping his hand into hers without a word, the two of them watching in comfortable silence as torches were lit one by one across the courtyard below. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly after a while. "The lie that brought you here in the first place?" Elena considered the question honestly, turning it over in her mind the way she had learned to turn over every difficult problem since arriving in this kingdom. "I regret the fear that made it necessary," she said finally. "I regret the weeks I spent too afraid to tell you the truth sooner. But I cannot regret the woman I became while carrying it, or the life that grew from finally choosing honesty over hiding." Cale squeezed her hand gently, his golden eyes warm in the fading evening light. "Then perhaps it was never truly a lie that brought you to me," he said. "Perhaps it was simply the long way around to the truth that was always waiting to be found." Below them, the palace continued its quiet evening rhythm, guards changing posts, servants finishing their final tasks, the distant sound of laughter drifting up from the training yard, where new recruits practiced late into the evening, under Hana's watchful guidance. It was an ordinary evening in an extraordinary life, one Elena Whitmore had never imagined for herself in all her years standing quietly in her sister's shadow. But standing now beside the Alpha King who had chosen her not because a contract demanded it, but because he had come to know exactly who she truly was, and loved her anyway, Elena understood that some of the most important journeys in life begin not with grand declarations or inherited destinies, but with a single, frightened girl stepping out of a carriage, wearing a borrowed name, and slowly, bravely, finding her own.